Hello, and welcome to the Creative Academy's Happy Hour with me. I am Eileen Cook, and today is June 12th, which is technically a lie. It's actually June 11th, and I'm coming to you via time travel, as tomorrow, the 12th, I will have no power in my house, and therefore no Wi-Fi, and therefore no Creative Academy for me. So I'm going ahead and pre-recording this so that you will have some interesting and helpful commentary. I'm going to be talking today about a commonly heard sort of writing piece of advice, and it's called Chekov's gun. And this, of course, comes from the playwright Anton Chekov, who wrote The Cherry Orchard, among other things. And it's advice you've probably heard bandied about, which is the idea of if you have a gun that shows up in the mantelpiece in Act 1, by Act 3, that gun has to go off. So that's the kind of advice that you hear, and as writers, we sometimes talk about it, but do we really know what it means? So there was a wonderful article about this very thing in Reedsy, if I can pronounce it correctly. And don't worry, I'm going to include a link to that if you like. That's a sort of regular kind of coming out piece of writing advice, newsletters, so forth. And they had this great article on it. And I thought it would be a useful thing to discuss. So I'm stealing quite liberally from the content that they provided. So you certainly can check that out as well. But Chekov's gun. So first off, this is not a rule. People who know me know I hate rules. I'm not a big fan of all this stuff where you must always do this and you must always do that. But it certainly is very common writing advice. And as they point out in the Reedsy article, it's often confused with foreshadowing. So Chekov's gun is sort of the unspoken rule, which you've now made spoken, that if you talk about a detail, if you mention something, if you draw the reader's eye to it, what you're telling the reader is this is somehow important and it's going to come back later. In essence, the way I think of it is that the reader is then waiting for the payoff. You've told me this detail, and at some point I'm going to get paid off for knowing that detail. Now, foreshadowing is a little bit simpler, but it's often happening, for lack of a better term, in reverse. That is, you're mentioning details that the reader may or may not notice, but later when you do have a big reveal, they can kind of go back and see that it was there all the time. So they're not waiting for the payoff because they don't necessarily notice the details, but you've sort of seeded them in there. They've been growing, and as often readers do, they're sort of coming to an awareness. Now, I've talked before that I think every single book that we write is to some degree a mystery. Now, you might not have a murder happening, you may not have a dead body, but there's some mystery that's going on for the reader. How is the character going to get themselves in or out of that situation? They're often wondering what's really going on. And that's why I think dialogue is so important, not just for what's said, but for what's not said. So all of those things are happening and going on at the same time. We're creating a mystery. And Chekov's gun can be really helpful to us as one technique that we're using to sort of help readers along with that by either saying, hey, this is a really important clue and you're going to need this to solve the crime. Or if we want to sort of have a twist or reveal in there, a way that we can promise that we're not cheating. There's few things readers hate more than if you have a sudden revelation that was never seeded earlier in the book. To them, that's going to feel like a cheat. So the example that was given in the article talks about if you have a character that, for example, can read minds, and you establish that in chapter 1 or in the first portion of your book, the reader is going to assume that if you've taken the time to describe this magic, to set up how they're basically reading minds, that reading minds is somehow going to be important to the overall plot. So they're probably going to use that skill or technique in order to solve the big problem, whatever that is. And quite often that's what's happening in the climax situation. Now, if in the climax situation, suddenly your character declares, by the way, I can read minds, the reader's not going to appreciate that very much because it's going to be a cheat. You didn't let them in on that. But you may have foreshadowed it, in which case it's not a cheat. So foreshadowing would be setting up clues, setting up things like they're frequently getting headaches. They have some odd insights. There's just some things that don't add up. And again, if the reader's feeling like this is a mystery, then they're noticing those things, hopefully. And as they're coming along, they're starting to build a case for what they think is going on. So that would be the difference between the two. So then the article dives into how exactly, now that you know what Chekov's gun is, how exactly do you use it? So the first thing they talk about is one, what they call spotlighting an item. And that's the idea that you're drawing the reader's attention to a particular thing. You're trying to sort of put a spotlight onto it so that they're sort of saying, oh, that thing there, that's an important thing. Now, sometimes this can be challenging, and I think this is really the difference between having details that matter and having details that don't. So as writers, we're always told you've got to show, don't tell, and that we should be using all these sensory descriptors. And so a lot of times what I'll see for first-time writers is that they are putting in tons of details. So they are taking time, of course I'm looking around to figure something to describe their backyard and the lush green and the box hedge and the furniture on the outside and the giant Japanese maple and the blooming hydrangea bush. And so they start describing all these things. So part of that can, of course, just be setting tone and setting up what the scene actually looks like. But the more that you're spending time on those details, the more the reader thinks those details in some way, shape, or form are going to be important. So thinking about what are those things that you want to be important. So again, in the example that's provided on Reedsy, what they talk about is if you take the time to describe a chair and how it's really old and you sink way into it and puffs of dust are coming up and all these kinds of things, that the longer you're spending on the chair, the more we're thinking that chair is pretty important. And almost where you need a situation where a person is stuck and sort of flailing around to get out of the chair in the final scene. And that's what will then make the difference. So that was spotlighting an item. The second thing they talk about is very similar, but it's spotlighting a character trait. So when you're thinking about character development and you're thinking about what makes this character unique or different, then those become the things that you might want to highlight. I was talking recently to a student here in the Academy about her work, and we were talking about the opening scene. And one of the things that I asked them to think about as they're thinking about rewriting that scene is what are the strengths that your character has when the book opens? Now, those may not be as fully developed as they need to become by the book's end, but what do they have sort of at the beginning? And then what are their weaknesses that, again, they have at the beginning that they're going to need to learn to manage as the book goes along? And sometimes what you can do to sort of have a bookend is you can show in those early chapters a time where we see a little hint of what that character's strength is, but the weakness is much stronger. So when they're faced with something that they have to overcome, they typically fail. Whereas again, in the final climax scene, on a much bigger scale with much bigger stakes, of course, you again have a similar scene where we see the character, but now their strengths have improved. They've learned to develop that. They've learned to make that matter a little bit more. And their weaknesses, they have learned to control slightly. So when they're confronted with this thing that they need to master, they're just a little bit better at it. So what's in a character and what they're talking about in the article is there are tons of things that make up your character. But what you're trying to highlight or bring to the reader's attention are what are the things that are important. So again, if you go back in the happy hour descriptions, you'll find a description of an exercise that I really encourage people to try, and it's called creating a character timeline. And I'm going to mention it again here just a little bit briefly so people don't have to go searching, and so that you get the idea of what I'm talking about. And this really comes from something that I used to do as a counselor with new clients that I was meeting. So if I was meeting you for the first time, I would sit down and I would say, I need to get to know you. What would help me a lot is to have a timeline or an understanding of where you're coming from. So draw a line. And at the beginning is birth. And over here is where we are today. Now, please tell me on the timeline, what are the major events that have happened for you? Now, if they're positive events, I encourage people to put them above the line. And if it's something that they consider to be a negative event, I have them put it below the line. And this was a very shorthanded way for me to understand a couple of things about someone that I was meeting for the first time and where I had a limited amount of time to get to know that person. So in a short amount of time, I got to understand from their perspective, what are the major things that have happened to them? What do they see as important? And what's relevant with that is what's important to me may not be important to you. What I see as positive above the line may be something that you see as a negative below the line. So for example, when I was doing this timeline for myself, I didn't list my high school graduation on the line as a major event. And the instructor I had at the time asked me why I didn't. And I sort of was like, I don't know, I guess his name was a big of a deal. And that actually tells you a lot about my character, where I come from, which is certainly in my family, everyone was a high school graduate. So getting a high school diploma wasn't really considered a huge accomplishment. Now, a good friend of mine was the first person in her family to graduate from high school. And you better know that that event was on her timeline. And again, I'm also really wanting to know, what do they see as positive and what do they see as negative? So for example, I have seen divorce listed above the line and I've seen divorce listed below the line. I have seen people who've had horrible catastrophic accidents listed as above the line because they feel like it took their life in a very different direction. So you can do that same timeline for your character. So again, if we're on this line is when they were born. And this part of the line is page 1 of your book. So what happened before they appeared in your book? And those are some of the details that you might want to highlight because those are details that are going to become important. It's a skill/gun that's going to go off in Act 3. Even the same with a weakness. A weakness can be a gun that you're showing in Act 1 that becomes a catastrophic problem for them, possibly in Act 3. So that's how what I'm talking about, personality being a gun. The next thing that the article mentions is to do something unexpected. So for example, you have two characters who are having an argument in a coffee shop, and suddenly this bizarre fellow walks in who's wearing a pink plaid suit and has a monkey on his shoulder and is playing the cymbals. So that's going to certainly act as a deterrent and will probably stop those two people from arguing because they will certainly take a look at it. But also from the reader's perspective, that's going to jar them in the story, and they're going to want that to have some kind of meaning, that this bizarre fellow, this unexpected twist takes your characters in a different place. And there's some reason why this bizarre character was there that might even be relevant to the main storyline. So it's not strictly coincidence. So one of the things that I know is that coincidence happens in real life a lot more than we think it does. But we tend to put meaning around it. When I was writing the book, The Hanging Girl, one of the things that I explored were fake psychics. And I learned how you could fake psychic ability. And one of the things they got into is sort of the psychological principle that we look for patterns and symbols. So we don't tend to think of things as just happening, even though they do. This is why you'll often hear people say, I had a dream about my grandmother, and the next day I found out she had died. And we have this moment that perhaps we've been touched just a tiny bit of psychic phenomenon. But the real issue is there may have been hundreds of times where you forgot the fact that you had a dream about your grandmother, and it just sort of slipped your mind a few moments after waking because you didn't then get a sudden secondary call telling you that she had passed away. So the dream isn't that unusual. It's just that we make it unusual. We make it have meaning because of the fact that this other thing has happened. That means in fiction, readers aren't very patient with coincidence. They are looking for things to have meaning and purpose. So if something unexpected happens, you better figure out a way where later we find out maybe it wasn't so unexpected. Having said that, I did have one writing teacher that said all the time, you could have a coincidence, but you only get one. And I've also heard the writing advice, which I quite like, that coincidence can get your character into trouble, but it can never get them out of trouble. So that's something to consider. So the next thing the article talks about is a red herring. And that's certainly a term that's used a ton in mystery fiction. And it's the idea that you are setting up something for the character to look at, to distract them in essence, while you're building something else. It's sort of like in magic shows where the magician will say, look over here. And while you're looking over here, you're not noticing something that they're doing on this side. So it's a way of distracting the person. So you'll see them most often in crime novels, but they're introducing an item in a way that makes the reader think it's going to be important, to assign a meaning to it that later will prove to be not necessarily the real thing. So even though it's a distraction, it shouldn't be total coincidence necessarily. It's something else that's going on that they just maybe not understanding the full essence of it. So for example, if I come downstairs and I see two people locked in an embrace, I'm going to make the assumption that perhaps that they're lovers or they have some kind of romantic relationship. And later I may discover that no, actually they're just really good friends and they were comforting one another in that moment. But it's not just chance that they're there. There's a purpose for them being there. They talk about having an element that carries implications in the article. And they point out that Chekov uses a gun because a gun has heavy symbolism, feelings, emotions, things that are attached to it. Whereas if it was a item of clothing, we wouldn't necessarily attach the same kind of purpose and meaning to it. So if you can have an object that could be more momentous than, say, a belt, then that is the kind of thing that you want to use. So the article also gives us just a couple of examples. And so I want to mention those to people as well. And again, if you go to the article, and I will put a link to Reedsy, no fears, you'll see it in a little bit more detail. But the first is from the book Ready Player One. And it's also a movie if you want to see the movie. And in Ready Player One, the main character is playing a video game and he scores a perfect score, which almost never happens. And by doing that, the game gives him a free quarter. So this is something that sort of happens. It doesn't necessarily seem like it's a big deal. That's sort of something that can happen. It doesn't seem outrageously weird. But later, much later in the book, in fact, he is playing a sort of life or death real stakes game. And he comes to a point where he's about to die. And he realizes that the quarter is actually, of course, a magical type quarter, and it entitles him to one free life. So he's able to take another kick at the can. So that's kind of a case of a little bit of foreshadowing. So you don't necessarily know that the quarter is going to be important. You're not necessarily waiting for that to pay off, but it is sort of shown to you. And then when you go back, you realize it was there the whole time. The other example that they use is from the Hunger Games. And in the Hunger Games, in the opening of the book, we find out that Katniss has a lot of street smarts, I guess, for lack of a better term, about what plants and what the healing properties of various plants are. So it's very helpful to her. And it comes up a couple of times. It comes up when she's in the arena as well. So once she starts training, she's actually able to help other characters to make sure they don't eat something poisonous. She sort of knows the medicinal qualities. And then, of course, it has the major payoff in the very end of the book. When the government has turned on them again, it's down to her and Peeta. What are they going to do? And of course, she knows that there are certain berries that will kill the both of them. And she threatens to use that. And that feels like a legit threat because we have established with those berries kind of on the mantelpiece that these are poisonous. The Katniss knows they're poisonous and she knows what to do with them. So those are just a couple of examples from Katniss's, or from the Hunger Games and from Ready Player One. So now, what should you do? So 2 parts. As I was mentioning a little bit earlier, I was talking to someone about their chapter 1. So some of this may be that when you are completely done with your story, you've written all the way to the end of the draft, now you know that the gun is important in Act 3, so you need to go back to chapter 1 and put it in. It may not have been there in your rough draft. You may not have realized it was important. You may not have realized because If you're like me, you don't know the character very well in chapter 1 because you're sort of writing your way into the story. But by the end of the book, you now know that there's a particular character trait that's important. And maybe you want to show just a little hint of that up in chapter 1. So that can be a way to sort of think about it in your own work, even if you're not necessarily the kind of person who outlines and knows before you've even written chapter 1, there's going to be a gun. Don't worry, pansters. You can put the gun back in. That's what revisions are for. Now, I'm a huge believer in learning from other writers, possibly why I'm using the example of Chekov's gun, but you can certainly use this a lot when you're reading. So if you have a book, and by this I mean not a library book, of course, but a book of your very own, if the writer is spending a lot of time describing something, or if you find yourself catching on a detail that seems like they're setting this up to be important, highlight it, then go back at the end of the book and figure out, was that detail important? And I'm going to hope that in many cases it was. The second way you can do it, of course, is by thinking about foreshadowing. So if there's a twist in the book that suddenly surprises you, I'm going to cough, so hang on. Someday I have high hopes of being free of this asthmatic cough. So with foreshadowing, if you have, for example, a big twist in a book, so suddenly where you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming, go back and see where the writer may have put those clues in for you. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Chekov's gun. I will put a link to Reedsy. I will be back with a live happy hour next week. So I would look forward to talking to everyone then. And until then, happy writing. And be sure to leave me any craft questions you have in the happy hour section. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.